The land of Louisiana, with its sprawling plantations, rich soil, and humid air, was a place of deep contrasts, a place of wealth and poverty, of beauty and brutality. The very ground seemed soaked with blood. The soil rich not just with nutrients but with the sweat and tears of those who toiled upon it. It was here, among the cotton fields and the moss-draped oaks, that the story of Marcus began. Marcus was no ordinary man. In the world of slavery, there were many types of men and women, some who were strong, some who were broken, and some who were invisible to the world. But Marcus was different. He was known among his people as the man with down, a term that spoke to a condition that made him unique. His physical appearance, marked by a rare and peculiar trait, set him apart. While the other slaves toiled in the fields or worked the mansion's halls, Marcus was often overlooked, underestimated, and at times, even ridiculed. But what the masters and overseers did not know was that Marcus, though an outcast in appearance, was far from weak. In fact, his position in the shadows allowed him to observe everything. He saw what others could not. He learned the language of silence, the art of invisibility, and above all, he learned that knowledge was power, and power was the most dangerous weapon a slave could wield. No one knew that behind his quiet demeanor and the mystery of his appearance lay a mind sharpened by the brutality of the plantation. It was a mind that would one day turn the tables on those who had tormented him. Marcus would become a man feared by the very system that had enslaved him, his mind more dangerous than any whip, his resolve stronger than any chain. And in the dark shadows of Louisiana, the world would learn that the most dangerous slave was not the one who fought with his fists, but the one who fought with his intellect and cunning. The estate stretched out before him like an endless sea of cotton fields, the white bowls standing like ghosts in the sun-drenched landscape. Marcus stood at the edge of the property, watching the laborers, his brothers and sisters in chains, move through the fields with an air of quiet resignation. He wasn't like them. While they toiled in the heat, Marcus was often given less strenuous work, often positioned inside the master's house, where he learned more than just the tasks expected of him. Marcus was born on the Fairview Plantation, a place notorious for its strict overseers and brutal treatment of the enslaved. The plantation was owned by Thomas Montgomery, a man whose wealth had been built upon the backs of people like Marcus. The stories of Montgomery's cruelty were whispered in hushed tones among the slaves, but they were nothing more than rumors to those outside the system. To them, Montgomery's grand mansion was a symbol of power, a testament to a way of life that was deemed unshakable. But to Marcus, the mansion was nothing but a cage, one in which his body might be trapped, but not his mind. From a young age, Marcus had been different. His condition, known as down, was a rare affliction that made his physical appearance unique. His skin lighter than most of the other slaves, his hair finer, and his features more delicate. This difference made him a subject of both fascination and ridicule. Some called him cursed, while others whispered about the blessing of his condition. But Marcus knew the truth. His appearance, though strange to them, didn't define him. What mattered was what he knew and how he used that knowledge. Growing up on the plantation was hard, as it was for any child born into slavery. But Marcus's mother, a house servant who worked inside the master's home, made sure he was different. She secretly taught him to read and write, skills that were strictly forbidden for slaves. She understood that knowledge was the only key to survival. If her son was ever to escape the cruel system that bound them, he would need a mind as sharp as a blade. Caroline Montgomery, Thomas's wife, had never cared for the slaves. She was a woman of high status, who enjoyed the luxuries that came with her husband's wealth, and Marcus was just one more tool for her to use in maintaining the order of her world. But she didn't understand that Marcus was different from the others, nor did she care to. To her, he was just another slave, no better or worse than the others who worked the fields or cleaned the house. His unique condition was a curiosity to her, a topic to be discussed in passing, but never fully acknowledged. Yet, in the eyes of the other slaves, Marcus was both a symbol and a mystery. He was often given tasks that were considered too insignificant for the others. He would polish the furniture in the house, tend to the gardens, and run errands for Mrs. Montgomery, all while observing the dynamics of the plantation. He heard the conversations between the master and his business partners, overheard the whispers about slave auctions, profits, and the plans to expand the plantation's reach. But Marcus never spoke of what he heard. Instead, he absorbed everything like a sponge, storing the information away for a time when he could use it. He learned the language of the masters, how they spoke, how they thought, how they operated. He began to realize that the true power on the plantation wasn't in the muscle of the overseers or the wealth of the master. It was in the secrets, the whispered conversations, the quiet betrayals, and the manipulation of the system that held everyone in their place. As he grew older, Marcus became increasingly aware of his position in the world. While the other slaves toiled away in the fields or worked their fingers to the bone in the house, Marcus learned how to read the world around him. He knew the rules, he understood the dangers of speaking out, of being too visible, of drawing attention to himself. But he also knew that he could never be free if he remained silent forever. One day, when he was just a young man, Marcus had a chance encounter with one of the overseers. The man, a brute by the name of Lucas, was drunk and stumbled into the stables where Marcus was working. At first, Lucas had tried to force Marcus into doing an errand for him, but Marcus, calm and controlled, refused. The confrontation could have ended violently, but instead, Marcus spoke. He spoke with authority and intellect, his words cutting through the drunken haze that clouded Lucas's judgment. "You think you own me because of the color of my skin," Marcus had said, his voice steady and unwavering. "But you're just a tool, Lucas, and tools can be replaced." For a moment the overseer stared at Marcus, confusion written across his face. But then, as though some invisible switch had been flipped, Lucas's demeanor changed. He saw Marcus not as a slave, but as something more dangerous, a man who could not be easily controlled. Marcus's ability to remain calm in the face of aggression, his understanding of the world around him, and his refusal to be cowed became the foundation for something much larger than himself. It was the first real taste of power he had felt, a power that came not from muscle, but from knowledge. And that power, over time, would become the most dangerous weapon of all. Marcus's reputation as a quiet, observant worker soon spread throughout the estate, though it was far from what he had intended. To those who worked alongside him, he was a figure of mystery, a man who rarely spoke but always seemed to know more than he let on. While other slaves labored under the oppressive heat of the fields, Marcus was assigned to tasks that took him inside the mansion, closer to the master's inner circle. It was there, in the grand house, where Marcus would find the true seat of power, and where he would begin to lay the foundation for the rebellion that would shake the very roots of the plantation system. The master's house. The house was a sprawling structure, built with the wealth and ambition that had driven Thomas Montgomery to create his vast empire. The rooms were filled with fine furniture, exquisite tapestries, and oil paintings of long-dead ancestors who seemed to watch over the house with judgmental eyes. Caroline Montgomery, his wife, was rarely seen in the kitchens or the fields. She was a woman of high society, dedicated to maintaining the outward appearance of grace, even as the world around her trembled with the weight of slavery. But Marcus was not concerned with the opulence of the house or the airs that Caroline put on. He was concerned with the secrets that lay hidden within its walls. The mansion, like many others, had its share of whispers. At night, when the laughter from the dining room faded and the last candle flickered out, Marcus could hear the sounds of hushed conversations between the overseers. These men, drunk on power and self-importance, would talk in the shadows, unaware that Marcus, always silent, always observant, was listening. It was through these conversations that Marcus began to understand how much of the plantation's wealth was tied to corruption. The Montgomerys were far from the benevolent, hard-working figures they tried to present to the outside world. Instead, they were ruthless, calculating, and deeply embedded in the system that kept their wealth intact. A silent listener. One evening, as he polished the floors in the master's study, Marcus overheard a conversation between Thomas Montgomery and one of his business partners, a man named Samuel Carter. The two men sat behind a desk stacked with ledgers and papers, their voices low but sharp with intent. "We need to increase production," Thomas said, his voice edged with frustration. "The market is demanding more. If we can't meet the quota, we'll lose our edge in the trade." "Don't worry about that," Samuel replied. leaning back in his chair. "We'll push the slaves harder. If they're not up to the task, we'll replace them. There's always a fresh supply of labor." Marcus clenched his fists, the rage building in him, but he kept his expression neutral. He had heard such conversations before, the complete disregard for human life, the casual way these men spoke of their property as if they were cattle. He was no longer surprised by the cruelty, but hearing it so plainly made something inside him snap. "Do whatever you need to do," Thomas continued. "The wealth of this estate will keep growing, and the land will remain ours. My grandfather's plantation legacy must be secured." And then, the words that shook Marcus to his core. "We'll need to tighten the grip on the rebellious ones. I've heard whispers of discontent. We can't have them thinking they can get away with anything." Samuel nodded, a knowing smile on his lips. "We'll deal with that. I have a few ideas on how to make an example of them." The catalyst. That night, as Marcus lay in his quarters, the weight of the conversation hung heavily over him. The way the men spoke of lives as if they were worth less than dirt. The way they discussed the enslaved as though they were tools to be discarded at will, it sickened him. But Marcus was no fool. He knew the risks involved, knew that to act on what he had heard would be suicide. There was no space for mistakes in this world. He needed more. But he also knew something else. He knew that if this plantation was ever going to fall, it would not be through violence alone, it would be through knowledge. Knowledge was what gave the masters their power, and knowledge would be the thing that brought them down. The quiet resistance. As the weeks passed, Marcus worked diligently, learning the ins and outs of the plantation. He found himself positioned more frequently within the house, attending to the needs of the Montgomerys, fetching messages and serving meals. But the work, though menial, gave him access to something more valuable than silver or gold: information. He learned that the Montgomerys were involved in various illicit trades ranging from land deals with other wealthy plantation owners to secret dealings with wealthy business magnates who had their hands in the textile mills. The wealth they hoarded was not just from cotton, it was from the exploitation of people, the manipulation of systems that kept the labor force under their control. Through overhearing conversations, Marcus also learned of a network of overseers and other landowners who worked together to keep the plantation economy strong. They had all sworn loyalty to one another, and together, they formed a powerful, closed circle that was nearly impossible to breach. But Marcus's plan was already beginning to take shape. He would gather knowledge, not just the secrets of the Montgomerys, but the secrets of every plantation nearby. He would expose their weaknesses, their manipulations, and their deals, turning their own system against them. The first spark of rebellion. It wasn't long before Marcus started recruiting others. He knew that the road to rebellion would require a united front, a movement of silent resistance that would only gain strength over time. He began speaking to the older slaves, the ones who had seen generations of exploitation, and he planted the seeds of discontent in their minds. At first, they were hesitant. Fear of retribution kept them silent. But Marcus knew that fear could be overcome with the right words, the right idea. He spoke of the strength of unity, the power of knowledge, and most of all, the hope of freedom. Slowly, one by one, the slaves began to listen. Each day, Marcus grew bolder. He whispered in the fields, in the kitchens, in the stables. He planted small acts of sabotage, deliberate mistakes in the crops, slowdowns in the production of cotton, and minor disturbances in the house. The overseers took notice, but they didn't suspect the true source. They thought it was just disobedience. But to Marcus, it was the beginning of something far greater. The seeds of revolution. Marcus's influence grew stronger with each passing day, and the rebellion began to take root. He had no illusions. This would not be an easy fight. The overseers were watching more carefully now, and the slightest mistake could lead to brutal punishment. But the spark had been lit, and it was only a matter of time before it would burn through the entire plantation. Marcus knew the road ahead would be dangerous, but it was a road he had already chosen. In the depths of the night, as the first whispers of rebellion spread through the estate, he felt the fire of change take root in his chest. He was ready. The days grew longer, and the air in Louisiana grew heavier with each passing moment. The plantation, once a symbol of wealth and power, now hummed with a subtle but undeniable tension. It wasn't visible at first glance. To the casual observer, everything appeared as it always had. The slaves toiling under the overseer's watchful eyes, the fields stretching endlessly toward the horizon, the mansion standing proudly at the center of it all. But underneath the surface, something had changed. The rebellion had begun in the shadows, quietly, methodically, but it was beginning to spread, like wildfire beneath the earth, waiting to erupt. The quiet resistance grows. Marcus had been planting the seeds of revolution for weeks, sowing them in secret whispers and quiet conversations with those who shared his longing for freedom. He started with the older slaves, those who had lived their entire lives under the oppressive yoke of the Montgomerys. Many were reluctant at first. They had seen the harsh punishments for defiance, the brutal whippings, the endless labor, and the despair that came with every failed attempt to fight back. They had learned to survive by keeping their heads down and their mouths shut. But Marcus had something the masters didn't count on. He had a plan, and he spoke with such quiet certainty that it was impossible not to listen. He told them of the way the masters had manipulated them, how they were nothing more than pawns in a game they didn't even know they were playing. He spoke of the way the economy relied on their labor, how their work, their sweat, and their blood had built the plantations, the wealth, and the power. He spoke of the power they had to bring the system to its knees. One by one, the older slaves began to listen. They shared Marcus's words with the younger generation, the ones who had grown up in the shadow of brutality, who knew only the fear of the lash and the promise of a life bound by chains. And soon, Marcus had a small but loyal group of followers, each of them waiting for the right moment to strike. The first signs of change. It began with small acts imperceptible to the overseers at first, but to those involved, they were the first signs of the rebellion taking root. In the fields, the work slowed. A few of the slaves would pretend to drop a tool or, accidentally, damage the crops, making it harder for the overseers to keep up with their quotas. These were simple, silent acts of sabotage, but they sent a message that the slaves were no longer willing to work without question. In the house, Marcus would deliberately miss small details, forgetting to light the lamps on time, serving food that was slightly too cold or improperly prepared. It was nothing drastic, but it was enough to unsettle Caroline Montgomery. She began to notice these small mistakes and started to ask questions. But Marcus, ever the quiet observer, always had a plausible explanation. The overseers, too, began to notice the changes. They had long relied on fear to control the slaves, but now that control was slipping. The slaves were growing bolder, more difficult to manage. The usual punishments were no longer enough to restore order. But it was the night of the full moon that would mark the true turning point. The full moon and the boldest act yet. The full moon cast a silvery glow over the plantation, bathing the fields and the mansion in an eerie light. It was the perfect night for a bold act. Marcus had been planning this moment for weeks, and tonight, everything would fall into place. He had carefully chosen the target's key overseers who were known for their cruelty, men who had abused their power time and time again. He had made sure that the slaves working alongside them were ready, positioned, and prepared for the moment when they would strike. In the silence of the night, the rebellion moved like a shadow. The slaves, moving quickly and quietly, surrounded the overseers' quarters. In one swift motion, the overseers were overpowered, gagged, tied up, and left in the barn to await their fate. The message was clear. The slaves were no longer afraid, but Marcus wasn't done yet. He knew that striking fear into the hearts of the masters was only the first step. He needed to send a message that would shake the very foundations of the plantation system, the masters' last stronghold. While the overseers were incapacitated, Marcus and his followers moved toward the master's house. They knew that this was the heart of the plantation, the place where the true power lay. It wasn't just about revenge, it was about dismantling the entire system of control that had kept them enslaved. Elijah, now one of Marcus's most trusted allies, led a small group toward the mansion's main door. They moved swiftly, silently, each step calculated. Inside, Caroline Montgomery was sitting in the parlor, unaware of the danger that was creeping closer to her. She had been troubled for days by the strange behavior of the slaves. But she had no idea that tonight would be the beginning of the end for everything she had known. Marcus and Elijah stood at the threshold of the house, looking inside through the window. Caroline was there, sitting alone, staring into the fire as if lost in thought. She didn't see them, but Marcus could see her clearly, the widow who had inherited everything her husband had left behind, the woman who had profited from the labor and suffering of so many. As Marcus watched her, he felt a moment of hesitation. It was brief, but it was there. Caroline was no different from the others in the system. Yet in her eyes, he saw a flicker of something more, a vulnerability, perhaps, or regret. But there was no time for hesitation. The system she represented had to be destroyed. Tonight, it all changes, Marcus whispered to Elijah. Elijah nodded, and together, they moved toward the door. The moment of reckoning. As the door creaked open, Caroline's head snapped up. Her eyes widened in surprise as she saw Marcus and Elijah standing there, flanked by the other slaves who had joined the rebellion. For a moment, there was silence, an air of disbelief. Caroline's mind raced, but she couldn't bring herself to speak. Marcus stepped forward, his gaze locked with hers. "It's over," he said, his voice low but full of authority. "The system you've built your husband's legacy, it ends tonight." Caroline stood frozen, unsure of what to do. But deep down, she knew he was right. Her wealth, her status, her life, all of it had been built on the suffering of others, and now, those very people were here to reclaim what was theirs. "Please," Caroline began, her voice shaky, but her words were cut off by Elijah's firm presence at her side. "There is no more begging," he said, his voice stern, and it echoed through the hall. "Tonight, you will witness the fall of everything you thought you controlled." Marcus took a step closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "The rebellion has begun, and there's nothing you can do to stop it." Caroline's lips parted, but she remained silent. The truth was undeniable, and she was faced with the reality of the world she had benefited from, a world that was now crumbling before her eyes. The beginning of the end. The night was just beginning, but already, the plantation was no longer the same. The slaves had risen, and they were taking control. The rebellion that Marcus had carefully orchestrated had come to life, and it was spreading like wildfire. The Montgomery's empire, built on the backs of the enslaved, was falling apart, piece by piece. And Marcus, the man who had once been seen as an outcast, now stood at the heart of it all, his mind, his strength, and his resolve, the driving force behind the revolution. But as the first step in their rebellion was taken, Marcus knew this was only the beginning. The battle ahead would be fierce, the stakes would grow higher, and they would be forced to confront not just the masters, but the very system that had held them all captive for so long. The next few days following the attack on the overseers and the takeover of the mansion felt like a whirlwind. What had started as small acts of defiance, a missed task here, a slowed pace there, had exploded into a full-fledged revolt that sent ripples of fear through the entire plantation system. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about the dismantling of an entire institution, one that had relied on the oppression of the enslaved for centuries. The mansion, which had once stood as a symbol of power and control, now stood as a battleground, its halls echoing with the sounds of resistance. Marcus had orchestrated the rebellion with precision, but now the danger was real. The group of rebels, led by Marcus and Elijah, moved swiftly, taking control of key points in the plantation. The overseers were still bound, locked away in the barn, but the real battle was yet to come. The final confrontation was drawing near, and Marcus knew that once the dominoes began to fall, there would be no turning back. The growing divide. As the rebellion gained momentum, the plantation's once powerful network of overseers, guards, and loyalists began to break down. Some of the enslaved, having witnessed the first signs of defiance, joined Marcus's movement, their loyalty shifting away from the system of exploitation to the promise of freedom. Others remained hesitant, unsure whether the risk of rebellion was worth the potential punishment they might face, but the stakes were too high. They could not remain silent. Not now, not when the chains of the system were breaking. Each new defection from the loyalists to the rebels strengthened their cause. Marcus's calm intelligence and Elijah's fierce determination had inspired hope in those who had spent their lives in fear. As they gathered in secret, preparing for the next phase of their plan, Marcus understood that it was no longer just about taking control of the plantation. They had to strike at the heart of the system, the very core of the plantation economy, the supply chains that fed the merchants, the wealth that kept the entire operation running. It was time to hit them where it hurt the most, the master's last stronghold. The plan was set into motion the following evening. Marcus, Elijah, and the core group of rebels snuck into the master's study, where they knew George Montgomery's private papers, financial records, business dealings, the proof of his illegal transactions were stored. These documents were the keys to exposing the corruption that had upheld the entire plantation system. Marcus knew that once these papers were in the hands of the abolitionists and the press, it would be nearly impossible for the Montgomerys or any other plantation owner to escape the consequences. Once these records go public, Marcus said to Elijah as they sifted through the stacks of ledgers, we won't just be tearing down this plantation. We'll be tearing down the entire system. Elijah nodded, his brow furrowed. We're gambling everything on this. If they find out before we act, then we fight, Marcus interrupted, his voice firm. But we will not stop. Not now. The tension in the air was thick with the realization of just how high the stakes had become. The risk of failure was greater than ever. As Marcus carefully copied down critical information, he couldn't help but think of the future, what would come after the rebellion had succeeded. What new world they would build, what battles they would still have to face. Freedom, once so distant, now seemed within their grasp. But Marcus knew better than anyone that freedom came at a price. The sounds of distant shouting outside interrupted his thoughts. The Loyalists were coming. The battle for control. The battle erupted like a storm. The Loyalists, armed with rifles and whips, had stormed the plantation, intent on reclaiming what they had lost. The overseers, freed from their confinement, rallied their forces and made their way toward the center of the estate. Marcus had anticipated this, and the rebels were ready. The plan had been for them to fight on their own terms, taking the battle to the places they knew best, the fields, the barns, the stables. The Loyalists had the weapons, but the slaves had the knowledge of the land. They knew the narrow pathways, the hidden corners, the places where they could move undetected. The first skirmish was brutal. The rebels fought with desperation, knowing that failure meant death. But it was also a fight for something far more significant, their future, their freedom. The clash of steel and the crack of gunfire filled the night air as the two sides fought for control. Elijah, standing at the front of the charge, wielded a pickaxe with the same deadly precision he had used to break his chains. He fought with the fury of a man who had nothing left to lose. Marcus, though not a warrior in the traditional sense, moved like a shadow among the chaos. His role was not to fight directly, but to direct, to coordinate, to guide the flow of the battle. Every decision he made counted. Every move carried the weight of the rebellion's success or failure. A turning point. The battle raged for hours, neither side gaining a clear advantage. But as the sun began to rise, the tide started to turn in the rebels' favor. The Loyalists, weary and demoralized, began to falter. Marcus saw the shift and pushed his people forward, urging them to finish what they had started. With one final surge, the rebels overwhelmed the remaining Loyalists, capturing or driving them off the estate. The Montgomerys' stronghold was broken. The mansion, once a symbol of power, was now a testament to the resilience of those who had been enslaved for generations. But even in the aftermath of victory, Marcus knew this was only one battle in a much larger war. The road to true freedom was not over. There would be more to fight for, more to overcome. The price of victory. As the smoke cleared and the sounds of battle faded, the plantation stood still. The once beautiful grounds, now scarred by the destruction, lay silent under the morning light. Marcus stood on the porch of the mansion, looking out over the land. It was theirs now, but the price had been steep. The blood of the fallen, both rebel and loyalist, stained the earth beneath his feet. Elijah joined him, his face grim but filled with a quiet satisfaction. "We did it," he said, his voice low but resolute. Marcus nodded, but his mind was already on the future. We've won today, but the war isn't over. This land, this system, it's just one piece of the puzzle. We've toppled Montgomery, but the plantation system is vast. The fight for freedom has only just begun. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Marcus turned to face Elijah, his expression hardening with resolve. The road ahead will be long and dangerous, but we'll walk it together. Elijah looked at him, his eyes reflecting the same determination. Together. And with that, Marcus knew that this was not the end. It was only the beginning of a new world, one that he and his people would fight for with every ounce of strength they had. The system was falling. The rebels had won the day, but the battle for true freedom would continue, one step at a time. The aftermath of the battle was a strange mixture of triumph and loss. The plantation, which had once been a place of wealth, dominance, and suffering, was now a shell of its former self. The fires of revolt had consumed the mansion, the overseer's quarters, and even parts of the fields. The landscape, scarred by the rebellion, would never be the same. Marcus stood at the heart of the plantation, looking out over the destruction. His body ached from the violence of the night, his mind still buzzing with the chaos and the adrenaline of the fight. The rebels had succeeded. Montgomery's empire was in ruins, but victory had come at a cost. There were bodies to bury, wounds to tend, and scars that would never heal. The price of freedom was steep, and Marcus felt the weight of it pressing down on him. The land was theirs now, but the future was uncertain. They had fought to break the chains of slavery, but what did true freedom look like when everything they had known was destroyed? A fragile peace. The first days after the battle were filled with tension and uncertainty. The plantation was now in the hands of the rebels, but the sense of victory was tempered by the realization that they had to rebuild, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally. The slaves who had once worked the fields were now free, but freedom came with its own set of challenges. The survivors of the rebellion were scattered across the estate, tending to the wounded, mourning their dead, and organizing the remaining slaves. There was no leader now. Marcus, once a quiet observer, had become the face of the revolution. His knowledge, intellect, and calm demeanor had made him the natural leader of the rebellion, but even he felt the weight of the responsibility. He was no longer just a slave, he was a symbol, and that symbol carried the hopes of many. But Marcus knew that the true cost of the rebellion was not in the blood spilled on the battlefield, but in the toll it had taken on the spirits of those who fought. The violence, the loss, the uncertainty, it would all leave scars, and some wounds were not so easily healed. Caroline Montgomery's fate. Caroline Montgomery, the widow of the man whose empire had been destroyed, was a ghost of the woman she had once been. After the rebels had taken the mansion, she had been confined to one of the guest rooms, isolated from the chaos. Her life had been shattered in a single night. The wealth and luxury she had once enjoyed now seemed like a distant memory, and the weight of her husband's betrayal hung over her like a shroud. Marcus had seen her once, after the battle, standing alone in the garden, her expression vacant. She had lost everything, the life she had known, her status, her sense of security. But in her eyes, Marcus saw something else, a flicker of recognition, perhaps guilt, perhaps something deeper, something that spoke of regret. "Are you going to punish me?" Caroline had asked him, her voice soft and broken when their eyes met across the garden. "Is that what this is about? Revenge?" Marcus had studied her in silence, his mind racing with the possibilities. He could have ordered her removal, condemned her for the role her family had played in the system of slavery, but something stayed his hand. He had already taken everything she had. What more could he do? "No," he had replied, his voice steady. "You've already lost everything, Mrs. Montgomery. Revenge won't change that. And now it things there most on a gold." Caroline had said nothing in response, her gaze dropping to the ground. For a moment, Marcus thought she might break down, but instead, she turned and walked back into the house, leaving him alone in the garden. A nation divided. While the rebellion on the Montgomery plantation had been won, Marcus knew that this victory was only one small battle in a much larger war. The plantation system was vast, stretching across the South like a web of interwoven power. What they had done, destroying a plantation and freeing the enslaved, was a victory. But it was only the beginning. The rebellion had been swift and successful, but Marcus knew that the forces of the old world would not give up so easily. The system of slavery was entrenched, backed by powerful men who would stop at nothing to preserve their way of life. The rebellion would not go unnoticed. The news of what had happened on the Montgomery estate would spread quickly, and Marcus feared the response. The government would send soldiers. The wealthy landowners would rally their forces. There would be reprisals. The question now was how far the rebellion could spread before it was crushed. And even if they could sustain their victory, what would they do with their freedom? The betrayal. Marcus had always known that the cost of rebellion was high, but he hadn't anticipated the betrayals that would come from within. As the weeks passed, some of the slaves who had joined the cause began to question their choices. The brutality of the rebellion, the destruction of the plantation, the loss of life, it was too much for some to bear. Rumors began to spread among the newly freed slaves. Some of them, frightened by the chaos, began to talk of leaving, of escaping to other parts of the South to find safety in the shadows. Others, disillusioned by the violence, began to question whether this rebellion was worth the price they had paid. They had fought for freedom, yes, but now that they were free, what did they have to build? It was one of these slaves, a man named Daniel, who had been part of the core group of rebels, who would be Marcus's greatest betrayal. Daniel had been a trusted ally, a man who had fought alongside Marcus in the battle. But as the months wore on, Daniel's fear grew. He had been one of the first to say that they needed to spread the rebellion, to join forces with other plantations and abolish the system entirely. But now, standing in the ruins of the Montgomery estate, he spoke of leaving, of returning to the life of a fugitive. "You've gone too far, Marcus," Daniel said one evening, his voice shaking with fear. "We've won a battle, yes, but we're outnumbered. The soldiers will come for us, and we'll be wiped out. We're better off leaving, going somewhere quiet, where they won't find us." Marcus stood, listening to Daniel's words, feeling the weight of betrayal pressing against his chest. He had given everything for this cause, and now one of his own was turning his back on it. "No," Marcus said firmly, his voice low but resolute. "You don't get to run. We fight, or we die. There's no turning back now." But Daniel's eyes had already hardened, and as he turned and walked away, Marcus knew that there was no convincing him. The betrayal stung, but Marcus knew that this was the price of freedom. Not just the physical toll of the rebellion, but the emotional cost, the loss of friends, of allies, of people who had once stood beside him. A bitter victory. The months following the rebellion were a time of rebuilding, but the pain of betrayal lingered in the air like a heavy fog. The freed slaves, now in control of the Montgomery estate, had to learn to live in a new world, a world that was both hopeful and uncertain. Caroline Montgomery, though a shadow of the woman she had once been, had stayed on the estate. She had no choice but to remain, as she had nothing left. Her wealth was gone, and with it, her power. But Marcus knew that she would never forget what had happened. In her, he saw a reflection of the larger world, a world of wealth and privilege that had been built on the suffering of others. As the estate was divided and the land redistributed among the newly freed slaves, Marcus took his place as a leader, not just of the rebellion, but of the new world they were building. But he knew that the fight wasn't over. There were still forces that would rise up to challenge them, still men and women who would seek to preserve the old ways. But Marcus had made his choice. He had given everything for freedom, and now, no matter the cost, he would see it through. The rebellion had begun, and the world would never be the same again. The aftermath of the rebellion had been both triumphant and devastating. The once vibrant plantation of Thomas Montgomery now stood silent and broken. The mansion was but a shell, its grand walls shattered by the violence of the revolt. The estate was no longer the symbol of power it once was, and in its place stood a new order, one forged by the sweat and blood of those who had fought for their freedom. But even as the rebels celebrated their hard-won victory, the reality of what lay ahead began to set in. For all the promises of freedom, for all the hopes of a better life, the world they now inhabited was uncertain, filled with challenges that Marcus and the others had not anticipated. The rebellion had toppled a single plantation, but the plantation system was vast, and the forces that upheld it were not easily defeated. The reprisals begin. It wasn't long before news of the Montgomery estate's fall reached the ears of other plantation owners, and the response was swift and brutal. The Southern elite, who had long profited from the enslavement of others, could not allow the rebellion to go unchecked. Marcus knew this, and he had prepared for the inevitable retaliation. But no amount of preparation could shield them from the wrath that was coming. The first sign of danger came in the form of soldiers, white men in uniform, heavily armed, sent by the government to quell the rebellion. They arrived in the dead of night, riding through the remnants of the plantation with the sound of their horses' hooves echoing across the fields. The rebels had no illusions. They were not simply being hunted, they were being hunted like animals. Marcus had expected the attack. But even he couldn't deny the fear that gripped him as the soldiers approached. The men who had fought alongside him, the women who had helped tear down the walls of the old system, now they were at risk of being wiped out in a single sweep. The decision was made quickly. The plantation would not be able to hold against the forces that were coming. It was a bitter truth, but one that Marcus knew they could not ignore. The surviving rebels, those who had fought so hard for their freedom, had to flee. The escape. The night of the soldiers' arrival was filled with chaos. Fires burned across the plantation as the rebels gathered what little they could carry: food, weapons, documents, anything that might help them survive on the run. Marcus moved swiftly through the estate, organizing the escape with the precision of a commander. He knew that time was running out, that the soldiers were closing in, and that the chance to escape was slim. Elijah, who had become Marcus's closest ally, helped coordinate the movements. Together, they made their way to the fields, where the remaining slaves, those who had joined the rebellion, and those who had remained loyal, were waiting. The plan was simple. They would head south, toward the bayou, where they could hide in the swamp and blend in with the local communities of free men and women who lived beyond the reach of the plantation owners. But even in the swamps, they wouldn't be safe for long. The soldiers would eventually find them. The only question was how long they could evade capture. As they slipped away into the night, leaving behind the only home they had ever known, Marcus felt the weight of their loss pressing heavily on him. They had fought for freedom, but now it seemed as though they were running for their lives, hunted once more by the very system they had sought to destroy. The price of defiance. The journey through the bayou was grueling, but it was the only option left. The rebels moved in silence, their footsteps muffled by the thick mud and the dense undergrowth. The air was thick with humidity, and the sounds of the night: croaking frogs, rustling leaves, the distant call of an owl seemed to close in on them as they made their way deeper into the swamp. As the days passed, the group began to dwindle. Some had been too injured to keep up. Others, exhausted from the fight, had collapsed from exhaustion or illness. They had no medicine, no proper shelter, and no guarantee of safety. But Marcus kept them moving forward. He couldn't let them stop, not when they had come so far. And yet, as he looked at the faces of those who had followed him, who had fought beside him, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of loss. The rebellion had cost them everything. They had lost their homes, their families, and many had lost their lives in the fight. And now, they were in hiding, fugitives in a land that had never truly been free. One evening, as the group sat around a small fire, Elijah spoke quietly to Marcus. "How long do you think we can keep running, Marcus? How long before they find us?" Marcus didn't answer immediately. He stared into the flames, the crackling firelight reflecting off his face. He knew the answer. There was no escaping the reality of what they had done. They were fighting a war that couldn't be won through hiding alone. They could run, they could resist, but the system they had broken still lived on. The masters would hunt them down until the end of time. "We fight," Marcus said finally, his voice steady but heavy with the weight of their predicament. "We don't run forever. We'll find others, build alliances, and we'll keep the fight going. We can't stop now." Elijah looked at him, nodding slowly. "And when it all comes down to it, Marcus, we'll stand together. We have to." The call for a new rebellion. The days turned into weeks, and the group made their way south, toward the border of Louisiana. They found shelter in hidden communities of free men and women, some of whom had escaped slavery themselves or were part of underground networks that helped runaways find refuge. These communities were scattered across the bayou and swamps, out of reach of the plantation owners and the soldiers. But even in these safe havens, Marcus could not escape the weight of what had happened. The rebellion had been a victory, but it had also been a loss. The price they had paid for freedom was more than just blood. It was hope, dreams, and the future. They had fought for something greater, but now they were scattered, broken, and unsure of what lay ahead. Yet in the hearts of those who survived, Marcus saw something that reignited the fire he had seen before. It wasn't just the promise of freedom, it was the belief that they could rebuild. The fight wasn't over. It couldn't be. And while the plantation system was still in place, Marcus knew that the rebellion had planted a seed that would one day grow into something far greater than the small battles they had won. They were not just fighting for their own freedom anymore. They were fighting for the future, one where the cycle of oppression and violence would be broken once and for all. The road ahead. As Marcus stood by the edge of the swamp, looking out over the murky waters, he knew that the fight had only just begun. There were still many obstacles ahead. There would be no easy victory, no simple escape. But they had already accomplished something that could never be taken away. They had proven that the system of slavery could be broken. They had shown that the enslaved could rise, fight, and win. The road ahead was uncertain, but Marcus knew one thing for certain. As long as he breathed, the fight would continue. The plantation system, the men who had ruled it, and the corrupt forces that had kept it intact would one day fall. And he, Marcus, the man who had once been invisible, the man who had been written off as weak, would be the one to see it happen. The story of the rebellion would live on, carried by the men and women who had fought beside him, who had given everything for a future they might never see. But in the depths of the bayou, in the hearts of the rebels, Marcus saw the spark of something that could never be extinguished. It was hope, and hope was the most dangerous weapon of all.